I think we have now started this session. So let me just welcome everybody into this mini symposium on how SCAR informs and guides Antarctic policy and conservation. My name's Neil Gilbert. I'm with Gateway Antarctica at the University of Canterbury here in Christchurch in New Zealand, and I'm also on the board of Antarctica New Zealand. And this mini symposium has been jointly organised by SCAR's Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System. And we thank Susie Grant from the UK and Cassandra Brooks from the US for their support in that. And also with the synthesis theme of SCAR's research programme, Ant-Icon. More on both of those initiatives shortly. But from the Ant-Icon side, Natasha, Gardiner, Hyoung, Chul, Shin, from South Korea and myself have also been involved in the organisation of this mini symposium. So over the next couple of hours, we will be exploring the fascinating world of the science policy interface in an Antarctic context, and hopefully demystifying some of the processes by which SCAR informs and interacts with the various bodies of the Antarctic Treaty System. SCAR has for many decades provided, and indeed continues to provide, high quality independent advice to the Antarctic Treaty System. And in increasingly uncertain times, arguably, there has never been a more important time for SCAR's role in providing consistent, evidence-based information to the decision-making community. And all the more reason then to examine and understand the effectiveness of that role. So this mini symposium is divided into two parts. First, we will have a series of speakers who will share their experience and their perspectives on the science policy dialogue. And then for the final part of the mini symposium, we will run a panel session where we will put some questions to our experts. And at that point, we would also love to hear your questions too. So just some housekeeping issues before we start. The mini symposium, as you will have heard from the start message, will be recorded so that it can be made available to registered participants in the past events section of the Open Science Conference website. And it will also be made available on the SCAR YouTube channel. So just a reminder to our speakers this evening, if you don't want your presentations to be included on YouTube, then please do let the organisers know. There will be opportunities to ask questions throughout this, and indeed we encourage all attendees to ask their questions. And if we don't get to them during the speaker part of the session, then we will come back to some of those questions during the panel session towards the end. So to do that, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom. Post your questions on there and we will be able to see them and work our way through them. And as I say, we'll come back to some of those in the panel session later on. So with that, let's get underway. And first, I would like to introduce my colleague Susie Grant from the UK, from British Antarctic Survey. Susie is a marine biogeographer at the British Antarctic Survey with an interest in developing scientific advice for policymakers in the polar regions, particularly in relation to conservation and management of marine ecosystems. She was a scientific advisor as part of the UK delegation to CAMLAR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, since 2005. And she is currently the Chief Officer of SCAR's Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System. And to tell us a bit more about SCATS, I'll hand over to Susie.
Thanks very much, Neil. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. Second. Okay, does that look okay? You can see the full screen of that. Great. Thank you. So good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much to Neil and the rest of the conveners. My name is Susie Grant. As Neil said, I'm the Chief Officer of the Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System, SCATS. And just to add my welcome to this mini symposium, I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our great speakers on their experiences of working at the Science Policy Interface, and also the chance for some discussion and some questions with our panel as well. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on a quick overview of what SCATS does. This organogram, I think you may have seen in other talks. It looks a little terrifying with a lot of acronyms to begin with, but it shows the structure of SCAR. SCATS is a very small standing committee that sits a little outside the structure of the other major SCAR groups. As you can see, it falls directly under the president of SCAR. It currently has 14 members representing the major SCAR science groups, and as well as the standing committees on the humanities and social sciences, and on data management and the scientific research programs. And it draws upon the expertise and advice across all of those groups, as well as some of the additional co-sponsored groups like ICE and SUS. Apologies for all of the acronyms. This won't be the last acronym that you hear, but we'll talk more about acronyms later on. And SCATS is also closely linked with SCAR's Antarctic Environments Portal, which we're going to hear a little bit more about from Keith later on as well. SCAR has had an advisory role within the Antarctic Treaty System since the treaty was signed in 1959, and SCATS has evolved from other groups within SCAR and is now the group which has responsibility of developing and providing SCAR's independent scientific advice to the treaty system. And that's in a very wide range of fields, particularly on environmental and conservation matters. SCAR also provides advice not just to the treaty system, but to other organisations like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well. So as I said, SCATS consults with SCAR experts and groups across all of that huge range of SCAR expertise to compile information, to formulate scientific and technical advice and recommendations on issues that are relevant to policy and management. And this is often in response to direct requests for advice from the Antarctic Treaty System, from the parties. So communicated to the meetings and also throughout the year. But it may also be proactive advice, so advice that perhaps hasn't been specifically requested, but it's information that SCAR feels is of interest to the treaty parties and their bodies. And I'll talk a bit more about the processes and the practicalities of how that's done a little bit later on. The SCATS committee terms of reference set out some guiding principles on how this advice should be provided by SCAR. And I think it's worth mentioning some of the key points from that. So the advice should, of course, be accurate. It should be independent, current, traceable to the source, and it should be based on a really broad and inclusive consultation. So we're looking to provide the most appropriate advice from wherever that expertise resides within SCAR. So we really need to consult as broadly as possible to find the appropriate expertise. And also that the advice needs to be timely. So often the treaty parties might say, well, we'd like information on this subject. We try to provide that as quickly as possible, but with the caveat that accuracy takes priority. So if it takes a little longer than the time frame that's set out, then that is the priority that we will set. SCATS priorities really are to really maintain and build on SCAR's existing reputation as that provider of independent scientific advice to the treaty. We really aim to communicate the priorities and the research needs that the treaty system has set out to the broader SCAR community. And I think it's really important that SCATS shares information on what happens to that information. So when scientific information is provided to the various components of the treaty system, what then happens to it? Are there policy outcomes? I think it's important that we share that information back again with the scientists who've provided it so they can see what the outcomes have been. We'd really like to continue building further collaborations with SCAR groups across the board on key topics of interest to the treaty, and to facilitate the involvement of interested researchers on the development of that advice, again, across the board on all SCAR groups, to really help people who are interested to develop that policy relevant scientific advice. And really one of the main focuses of this symposium, involvement of early and mid-career researchers, not just early and mid-career researchers, really anyone who is coming into this space, who has an interest. But we really would like to provide some opportunities for early and mid-career researchers to gain some more experience of working at the science policy interface. And again, a little more on that later on. So I just want to acknowledge all the members of the SCATS committee who really work very hard to coordinate inputs from their groups, to develop advice, to review the often really large number of papers submitted by SCAR to the Antarctic Treaty meetings and other meetings, as well as extending thanks to all of the SCAR groups who contribute their information and expertise and advice through SCATS. So I'll hand over now to Hyoung Chul, who will introduce Ant's icon and the synthesis theme. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Right, can you see this in full screen mode? All right, okay. My name is Hyoung Shin from Korea Polar Research Institute, agency for the National Polar Research Program of Republic of Korea. Now, this mini symposium is a sort of joint venture between SCATS and Anticon. If SCATS is something like a conduit or pipeline or funnel for scientific advice to Antarctic Treaty System, Anticon is a research program. Anticon is one of the 3 SCAR scientific research program, and the reason you see these 2 names, they are the chief officer of this scientific program. Now, the rationale is Antarctic and Southern Ocean are threatened on several fronts by a number of stressors. Now, as you just heard, SCAR and ATS, well, it has been 6 decades since SCAR began to provide scientific expertise and advice to the Antarctic Treaty System. What we do is provide support to having conservation objectives achieved, and we identify new emerging challenges, and we work toward scientific research and policy alignment. Now, the broad objectives of this Anticon program is facilitate and coordinate high quality research, integrate different research disciplines and ways of knowing, and then inform international policy responses and help to generate effective environmental governance. To do this, research available at the right time and in the right way are very important. Now, I'm introducing mostly synthesis theme, but Anticon is composed of 4 major elements. 3 of them are more on research. First, current states and future projections. And then second one is sustainability and impact of human activities. And the third one is socio-ecological approaches to conservation. And then here it comes synthesis. Now, what is synthesis doing? Now, science is synthesis to help to inform decision-making and policy development. So the purpose of integrating scientific outputs are to advise conservation planning in a systematic way, species assessments and protection, and having vulnerable ecosystems identified and managing human activities, hopefully minimizing human footprints. Now, then to input into decision-making frameworks and coming up with management strategies and vulnerability assessments. The more ultimate ambition is to quantify and to deal with biases and uncertainties in decision making. Here we have three of us in this synthesis sim, myself, Neil, who has opened this mini symposium, and Natasha, Gardiner, who you will hear from later on. Now, we're going to move to presentation. We will have 5 speakers before we have a panel discussion. 5 speakers will talk either for 10 minutes or 5 minutes. Firstly, on the mechanism between science and policy engagement. And second one is impact. And the third one and fourth one is about practical opportunities. And in the last, you will hear from ECR, early career researcher, concerning ECR perspective. Now, the first speaker will be Susie Grant. I don't need to reintroduce her. In the capacity of the chief officer of SCAS, she will talk on, as I said, mechanisms of science and policy engagement. Susie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyoung Chul. I'm just going to share my screen again. Just give me a thumbs up if that's appearing. All good. Great. Okay, so I'm afraid it's me again. Apologies for that. Just having given a very brief introduction to SCATS, I'm now just going to talk a little bit about how the different components of the Antarctic Treaty System work in practice, what the various bodies do, what their responsibilities and priorities are, how they undertake their work, who is involved, etc., and particularly how SCAR fits into this process. So I talked earlier about how SCAR has a role in providing independent advice via SCATS, but how is this actually done in practice? And most importantly, how can we engage more of the SCAR community in this process and facilitate the involvement of those who want their research to have policy impact? So one of the first things that people notice about the treaty system is that it is full of acronyms, just like SCAR, in fact. And it can be a little daunting and often confusing, entering a world where everything seems to be reduced to 3 or 4 letters. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail or test you on them at the end. But I did just want to acknowledge that we really have to be careful not to assume that everyone knows what we're talking about when we're referring to all of these different groups and structures within the treaty system. So I'm going to try to explain at least some of them over the next few minutes, but we wanted to focus this symposium on the practical advice and pathways for science policy interactions. So I won't go into too much detail on the specific groups or policy topics, but instead I'll focus a little more on the general mechanisms for how advice is provided, and then give a couple of recent examples of where that interaction and advice from SCAR has the most impact. So just to start with a map, this is from a paper by Kevin Hughes and colleagues. The Antarctic Treaty as it was signed in 1959, and it applies to the area south of 60 degrees south. So that's this line, the Antarctic Treaty boundary around the continent here. The parties, the signatories to the Antarctic Treaty, meet annually at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, the ATCM, and then signed a little bit later on in the 1991, I think, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. This is the instrument that designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. So that covers the same area, the Antarctic Treaty area. And the Committee on Environmental Protection meets alongside the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting as an expert advisory body to provide advice and formulate recommendations to the ATCM. The Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, That convention covers a slightly broader area, so it goes right out to the sub-Antarctic out here. The Commission regulates fisheries in the Southern Ocean, and its members meet annually, again, to agree legally binding conservation measures, determining the use of marine living resources in the Southern Ocean, and that's developed on the basis of advice from its scientific committee and its working groups. SCAR is an official observer to the Antarctic Treaty, and it provides independent scientific advice to all three of these bodies. So just a couple of little diagrams here. You can see how there's this sort of flow of information or a process right from the research undertaken across the Antarctic science community, whether that's affiliated to SCAR or in national Antarctic programs or wherever that may be happening. That research published or comes through into the treaty system in a number of different ways. It can come through parties to the Antarctic Treaty, through national delegations. It can come through a range of observers and experts, and those observers, as I said, include SCAR. And this is where the kind of information and recommendations are formulated and presented to these groups, to the Committee on Environmental Protection, as I said, which then advises the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. But SCAR and the other observers and parties can also provide advice directly to the ATCM as well. So you've kind of got up there to advice up here, and then finally to that decision-making level. Each of these groups, the CEP and the ATCM, have work plans which will inform their agendas from year to year, so they will set out their priorities. And that's really useful for SCAR and for everyone else to plan their work and to understand what the priorities are from year to year. And those are, I think, publicly available on the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat website. So just some of those topics and the key topics of concern to the ATCM. This isn't all of the things that they do. They're also involved in many other things, but these are really the key things that SCAR is most involved in. So environmental impact assessment is a key part of the work of the CEP, along with considerations of managing pollution, environmental monitoring. The treaty and the CEP consider tourism, both management and monitoring of tourism, codes of conduct for scientific activities and other activities. And a couple of the issues really high on the agenda at the moment is reducing the risk of introduction of non-native species. The treaty parties are interested in information on bioprospecting as well. Specially protected areas and specially managed areas are a very, very large component of the work of the CEP. And specially protected species are also considered as well, and I'll come on to that later. And finally, I think something which is really overarching across all of these issues is the environmental implications of climate change. Just a quick look at CAMLA. Works in a fairly similar way, but a little differently. Again, this sort of research base from the Antarctic science community going through into parties, national delegations, and also to the observers to CAMLA, including SCAR. There's a little difference here in that the scientific committee has these working groups. They have a number of working groups which address different topics, and they are very much focused on the scientific advice going into the scientific committee. So SCAR has a slightly different role there, in it does provide information, but it doesn't have such a large role in providing that advice as it does in the ATCM. But that progresses up to the scientific committee and finally the decision-making in the commission. And both the commission of CAMLA and the ATCM are really implementing the legal framework for Antarctic governance. So this is the policymakers who are often representatives of governments or ministries, and they will be, the highest levels of those groups will adopt reports, and that is done by consensus, which means that everyone has to agree. And if one party does not agree, then that can't go forward. And similar situation of going right up to consensus agreements on that, developing that legal framework in both CAMLA and the ATCM. The key topics of interest to CAMLA, of course, harvested species, and again, SCAR has a lot of expertise in the biology and ecology of those species, and particularly on krill and fish. Also the associated and dependent species, so those species like the seabirds, the marine mammals that rely on those harvested species for food. Incidental mortality and bycatch, so trying to reduce the risk of other species being unintentionally caught or harmed. Vulnerable marine ecosystems, on the seafloor is an area of great interest to CAMLA, and also the protection of areas for special protection, spatial management, observation of the oceans, monitoring, marine ecosystem monitoring, and that really kind of basic understanding of how the Southern Ocean works is absolutely critical to the work of CAMLA. And again, overarching everything really is the impacts of climate change. So how is SCAR's advice provided, or how does this work in practice? Firstly, as I said, the development of information and advice, both responsive and proactive, and that's based on publications primarily, but also on specific consultations, sometimes on workshops and commissioned reviews. And it's really done in a very consultative way to try and get that broad base of advice across the expertise that we have in SCAR. Working papers and information papers are the primary mechanism for information to go into these meetings. So they're drafted often by small groups of authors within SCAR groups or within SCATs, and they're always reviewed by SCATs before being submitted to the meetings. Participation in the meetings themselves is by a small delegation from SCAR, which is usually some combination of the president, the executive director, and then others from SCATs, and sometimes other groups as well, depending on the topics being discussed. We also have SCAR lectures to the ATCM and CAMLA now, also for the first time this year, on key topics of interest. And this really provides an opportunity for SCAR to go into a topic which we think is critical for the parties to learn more about in quite some detail. The Antarctic Environments Portal we'll hear a bit more about later on, and that provides information summaries directly aimed at policymakers. And then we also have a lot of engagement in these kind of activities in between meetings, or often called intersessional activities. And that can be, for example, online discussion forums or workshops. And there's also a lot of collaboration, communication with parties and with other observers. So there is a lot of routes for engagement here of how that advice is provided. The meetings themselves are an interesting experience. The photo on the top left here is from the recent meeting of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting and the CEP, which was held in Berlin a few months ago. You can see a very large room, lots of flags, lots of people sitting around tables behind flags. On the right, this is a CAMLA meeting, which is often quite squeezed into a lot smaller room. They're often very long days, lots of discussion of the papers being submitted, sometimes small groups working to resolve issues or to develop further advice, and then finally to agree on report text that can be adopted, and those measures that can be agreed. So there's the photos below, a view from the SCAR delegation to the treaty meeting in Berlin. SCAR, as I said, provides advice on a really broad range of issues, and this is just going back several years to the last 8 or so years of treaty meetings, and you can really see that these are, the titles of these papers. This is just a sort of random selection of the papers that SCAR submitted. All of these papers are available on the SCATs page of the SCAR website. So if you're interested to see what these papers look like, they're quite different to a scientific publication, a peer-reviewed publication. In a journal, they're often quite short. They contain very specific recommendations, but they're all available. All of the papers that SCAR submitted, alongside all of the SCAR lectures to the ATCM as well, are also available on their website. So I just wanted to talk now a little bit about a couple of specific examples of how this advice has been used and taken forward in a couple of recent topics. Firstly, special protection for emperor penguins. This has been a topic of interest, great interest to the ATCM for the last few years. This really came from a lot of research coming out from the emperor penguin and seabird experts, highlighting the vulnerability of emperor penguins to projected warming and habitat loss. Following this, there were some UK-led papers to the CP together with other parties and with SCAR that called for further consideration of conservation planning for this species. You know, what, if anything, needed to be done to give them any sort of additional management to reduce that vulnerability. The SCAR expert group on birds and marine mammals, EGBAM, then convened a small group to review the conservation status of this species. And following that, we had a SCAR paper submitted to the CP last year, which advised that the emperor penguin was considered to be vulnerable, concluding that its designation as a specially protected species under the provisions of the treaty was necessary, was warranted. The CP then agreed to develop a draft action plan, drawing upon SCAR's advice. SCATS, along with experts from EGBAM, contributed to the intersessional discussions on developing further that action plan in collaboration with other colleagues from other parties and observers. Unfortunately, agreement was not reached on this in 2022. This year, there was one party was unable to agree to this, but we hope that further research might help to reach agreement in the coming years. But I show this example because it really illustrates the depth of SCAR's work on this, the really extensive expertise that was put into this, but also the fact that it takes a lot of time. You know, it was disappointing that agreement wasn't reached this year, but I think it is a long process. We have to. I think it has been a very positive process in some ways. We've developed this action plan. There's been a huge amount of work looking at what the research priorities would be for emperor penguins and how we can ensure their conservation status is improved and that population is looked after. So it is a long process. It may take some more time, but I think SCAR's involvement in this has made a big difference so far. Just one other example, the Antarctic. The major contribution from SCAR to the ATCM this year was the Antarctic Climate Change and the Environment Decadal Synopsis Report. SCAR published its first ACCE report in 2009, and it's provided regular update reports to the treaty parties and to CAMLA since then. The 2022 Decadal Update report was led by Stephen Chul with co-authors from across SCAR groups, as well as a large number of reviewers, both internally within SCAR and externally. And it's based largely on the findings of the most recent reports of the IPCC and other reports, as well as the research priorities identified by the SCAR Horizon Scan and by the scientific research programs. The report has policy recommendations around communication with government, supporting research, addressing management and logistics challenges, as well as research recommendations setting out priorities for reducing uncertainty. And I'd encourage you to download the report and have a read if you haven't seen it already. Again, it's available on the SCAR website. It also contains some really excellent infographics, and these were done by Laura Phillips at Monash University. And these were absolutely key to making this information available and accessible to policymakers and non-experts. And I think this is a really important way of communicating information. The report was very well received. It was really encouraging to hear the parties referring back to it all throughout the meeting, and several really strong actions were agreed as a result of its recommendations. So just finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that researchers from across SCAR can get involved in the provision of SCAR's advice, just sort of reiterating some of the points I think I made earlier. Publications are really key. Publications that contain policy relevant findings, you know, things that are in the public domain as a peer-reviewed publication, really form the backbone, the basis of that scientific evidence that SCAR can provide to the Antarctic Treaty System. There are lots of ways to engage through SCAR groups, through the SRPs. Most of those groups have SCATS representatives, and you can see who those are on the SCATS pages of the website. There are a number of workshops, consultations going on on some of those topics, which I highlighted earlier throughout the year. So there may be opportunities to get involved that way. author groups preparing ATCM and CAMLR papers. We do try to draw upon a range of authors across the SCAR expertise. So again, through the SCAR groups, opportunities there. The Antarctic Environments Portal, the preparation of information summaries is a really key way of getting information out there. And identifying emerging issues, horizon scanning, or looking at issues which perhaps the treaty parties are not aware of yet. If you within your groups have really burning issues that you think the treaty parties should be aware of, then please do let us know, talk to SCAT's representatives, and we would love to discuss that further. There are opportunities through national delegations as well. As I said, it's not just SCAR which provides advice, so it's also great to look in your national delegation, what their priorities are, national funding opportunities. And just finally, a couple of things that we hope to have up and running soon. We are really excited to be developing a joint policy fellowship scheme between Anticon and SCATS, and hopefully that will be up and running next year, which will allow participation of an early career researcher in to actually come and attend those meetings and be involved in the SCATS work towards providing advice there. And just finally, we will hope to have a SCATS detail, just to provide a little more detail and an opportunity for discussion on the outcomes and priorities from the ATCM and CAMLR. Further details on that soon. So I think that's it from me. I will hand you back to Hyoung Chul. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. That was a well laid down class 101 of mechanisms of science policy connection. I'm afraid there is no time for question. So let me just go straight to the second speaker. It's good time to hear from scientists about policy impact of science. Tom Bracegirdle from British Antarctic Survey is a climate scientist, mostly on physics, the linkages between polar regions and beyond. Tom is the chief officer of the new scientific research program SCAR and CLIM now. Tom, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you see my main presentation screen okay? Excellent.
Yes, we can, Tom, thanks.
Very good. So I'm just going to get my laser pointer ready. Here we go. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk at this symposium. I think it's going to be a really interesting session. I've got a short amount of time to show a few slides and a few reflections. These are really more reflections from my own experience as a climate scientist, not so much the broader AntClim Now view, but I am strongly affiliated with AntClim Now. I'll have to skip through some of the things quite quickly, so we can always come back to them in the discussion. So if there's anything that isn't clear, you can always ask about it afterwards. I thought to kick things off, as a scientist, I thought I would show a plot. Because actually, I think communicating climate change science is challenging. But I think there are also ways forward. Many of us are familiar with IPCC type projections with mean temperature changes across different parts of the planet. And so, looking at maps like this, you probably often look at the area of interest and see how much warming there is in the particular area that you're interested in. But maps like this, although useful, they also mask important information. So I've plotted a time series plot here of surface air temperature projections at the Rotherham Research Station, just to give an example of what you might see at a given research station. And this is one climate model simulation of temperature in the winter mean, so winter temperature at that station. And you can see year to year it jumps up and down. There's some decades where it's a bit warmer, some decades where it's a bit cooler. But eventually you can see a background warming signal emerging. If you run the climate model again, you see something similar, but the wiggles are in a slightly different place. So maybe this, but still a bit of a warm period happening, maybe before the year 2000 is a decade here. And then less variability and a bit slightly cooler for this period of time. Could that be something so different? Maybe it's some external forcing. Well, I can run the model again. And this version is exactly the same model, exactly the same climate forcing, but that simulation even looks a little bit different again. And in fact, it has a very warm winter just before 1920. And in that run, there's no warmer winters until maybe 2030 or something like that. So that was a very extreme winter that happened quite a long time ago in that simulation. And it took until then for that to be exceeded. If you run it 50 times, and then take the average of all those, you then see the sort of background climate change coming through the main signal. The point being that, you know, if you're looking at the next decade or the next year, there's lots of year-to-year variations on top of the background climatic change. And so this is just one example of some of the challenges of communicating our expectation of how climate might change in the near term or into the future for any one given model or reality, in addition to the background changes. We can come back to that. So I was asked to think about possible factors influencing uptake of climate research by policymakers, and three things that I feel are important are accessibility, interpretation, and relevance. So I'll come on to these in more detail, one by one, but ease of access to information in terms of accessibility, in terms of interpretation, the importance of expert knowledge, and relevance, which climate research is of most relevance to policymakers. Well, for accessibility, scientists in general are motivated and rewarded by publishing papers. And, you know, in many cases, not so much beyond this, although I think that's changing. And there's lots of great examples of scientists who you know, follow things through really well after they've published a paper in terms of the impact side of things. Synthesis reports such as the ACCE and IPCC reports are great for providing the big picture of major findings in an accessible way. There is a challenge, however, in providing specific actionable information for particular applications. So if you're interested in, say, a specific location or an aspect of policy, the detail required for that isn't always generally included in these big picture reports. So I'll just share with you an example from the UK of a really major project that tries to address this type of issue. It's called the UK Climate Projections Project, and this is just taken from their website. I'll maybe share it in the chat later. But they have it's a collaboration between the Met Office, the Environment Agency, and other departments of the government. And I'm sure many countries have similar things to this, but it's just an example of a portal where users can go and access climate information about the UK. But there's lots of information out there. I'll stop there, we can maybe come back to that. Interpretation. Well, even well-prepared data sets can include aspects that could be misinterpreted by non-experts and even experts. So ideally, we really need a two-way dialogue and communicating climate science. I think, you know, in many ways, SCAR and related bodies do actually a pretty good job of this. But it does require resources, person hours, technical, etc. You know, the UK Climate Projections Project is one example. And then for my further slides, internal climate variability is challenging to deal with, both in terms of prediction and in terms of communicating uncertainty. In those first few slides I showed, we know that the background change is the average of those 50 different simulations, but what do we say about the wiggles on top of that in terms of how we expect things to change? Relevance. What's the balance of relevance between the latest research findings and well-established and robust scientific knowledge? So, a really exciting new paper that came out last year probably highlights a new idea that could take further studies to establish robustness. But maybe the most relevant research is research that's a decade old, that's very well reviewed and has been repeated many times. How can scientists be helped to judge what's most relevant? We can discuss that. Uncertainty is a key factor. So, scientists like to focus on what we don't know. We spent a lot of time discussing this, but we often pay less attention to what we do know. And actually, when we're talking to people in other disciplines, what we do know is really the most important thing. What more can be done? Well, I think actually, in a way, I struggle to answer this question because there's actually a lot of really good stuff being done. I think regular updates on science advances, and the ACCE update is a good example. But maybe SCAR groups could think about this in their activities. It's something that we're thinking about in Anklin now. Investment in providing actionable climate change information is really challenging, but it is an important thing to keep in mind. Groups could help raise awareness of SCAR science advances with members when they join. I think that would be really something that actually I haven't thought too much about, but for Anklin now, when new people join, in many cases they might not be aware of some of the mechanisms and procedures and resources available, such as the Antarctic Environments Portal and the SCAR ATS, SCATS. So just raising awareness within groups of new people, I think, would be one approach. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Thank you, Tom. I thought I should be and would be merciless as a timekeeper, but I'm failing because I myself am being observed. All right. Now it's time to go on to the third speaker about practical opportunities of science and policy engagement. I cannot think of a better person to talk on this than Keith Reid. Keith has been was a scientist, but had been with Camilla for many years as a science manager. Now he serves as the editor of Antarctic Environmental Portal. No further ado, Keith, the floor is yours.
Very much. Thank you very much, Chul, for that flattering introduction. I shall try and live up to the billing. And I'll try and be relatively brief as well, because I know there's some much more exciting speakers to come after me. What I'm going to talk about, a little bit like Tom did, was a bit about the work I'm involved in with SCAR, but also just some reflections on delivering policy advice and the sort of challenges that might exist there. So the Antarctic Environments Portal is a web-based set of information summaries on the topics you can see in this top banner here. It originated within the Committee for Environmental Protection. And I'm sorry, I've used an acronym straight away. How dreadful of me. So the CEP there is the Committee for Environmental Protection. But it was migrated into SCAR, and I took over as editor last year from Neil Gilbert. Terrifyingly large shoes to fill, but he's very supportive and nice, so it's good. The role of the portal really is to provide the scientific background that helps policymakers and managers understand the science that's being used in those decision-making processes. Importantly, and differently to the SCATS group, we don't provide advice. It's really just to provide science-based background to help that policy-making process. The publications that are on the portal have a DOI, so they are published. They're also published, importantly, in the 4 languages of the Antarctic Treaty. Typically, a lot of science is published in English, and in the Antarctic Treaty System, there are 4 official languages. And so delivering that advice, an important part of that is to have it in the Antarctic Treaty languages. You can see the URL here. It's one of the easier URLs, and indeed my email if you want to get in touch, editor@environments.aq. It's fairly straightforward, but I really would encourage you to go and have a look at the portal and see what you make of it. Provide feedback, get in touch, and if you work with policy people, get them to have a look at it too. What I want to do now is just briefly talk a little bit about how we make science matter, how we have an impact in science. And this is a slide that I've used repeatedly and shamelessly stolen from a colleague at UTAS, but I think it works very well. Because we often find ourselves in a situation where, from a science community perspective, all of the science is shouting in the same direction, and the management decision that should come from that science is so obvious that it's almost unbelievable. And yet, if we switch that round to look at the perspective of policymakers, they have a suite of considerations that are on their plate, one of which is science. So it doesn't make the science any less important or less compelling. It's simply one of a suite of pressures and one of a suite of interests that they need to listen to in order to come to that decision. So I think that sometimes as a science community, we can be perhaps deluded by the combined might of the science saying what the management decision should be, without necessarily having that awareness of the perspective of the policy making side. And that's something that I've been I guess, lucky enough to work on both sides of the fence and a bit in the middle, and seen those sorts of things. And it's definitely something that I think, in terms of taking science into policy, we need to be aware of those other things. And for this, if you imagine this picture as the pressure in a single, let's say a single government to come up with a management decision, if you then replicate that 30, 40 times, that's the levels of agreement that we need to reach to make multilateral decisions in things like CAMLR and the Antarctic Treaty. But don't despair, and this is important. I think we need to see this as an opportunity. And as has already been said, the Antarctic space in terms of science and policy offers some fantastic examples of success. It has some frustrations too, but it has a lot of examples of success. And these are just a few observations from my perspective, and my experience. From the science community side, we often talk about we need to make this available for policy people or managers. Now, these are not some otherworldly beings that you can't possibly meet. If you don't know if you're writing something for policy people or for managers in the Antarctic space, and you don't know who they are, it's pretty challenging to know what to write. So I would definitely advise you to go and meet them. Go and find out who they are. They're just people like us. Write to them, make an appointment. You might even have to travel to the capital, who knows? But go and do it. Because if you make those personal contacts, your ability to have your science making an impact will be commensurately greater. A little bit of a warning around what I've referred to here as the short-term narrative. Don't worry too much if at the end of every CAMLR meeting, all the headline news is that CAMLR has failed to do something again, or the Antarctic Treaty failed to do something again this year. Typically, science, and particularly NGO funding, can be quite short term. So there's often a focus on what hasn't been achieved, and actually probably a little bit of a what has been achieved goes unsaid, and I think more people will say that as well. And against that background, don't give up. I know I'm looking at someone's face who's been working on marine protected areas for a long time. It's a couple of people here, and it can be frustrating. But we make small steps, and in many cases, particularly in the Antarctic space, we do get there. So that's my reflection on the Antarctic Environments Portal. It's an important and it's a recognized place where policymakers go and look for information. But also don't give up on delivering your science into that space, and go and find your customers and talk to them and see what they want from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Keith. That was insightful and inspiring and encouraging. Now you will hear more about real practical opportunities, how you get involved. She will provide some useful tips as well. And as I hope you can remember from my beginning slides, Mecha Santos is one of the 2 chief officers for the scientific research program of SCAR. And Mecha has been affiliated with Argentine Antarctic Research Program over many, many years. Now, Mechas, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good night to everyone. I'm here to speak about some practical opportunities, how to get involved in this forum as we have been talking now. This is in relation to this program that was introduced early, Integrate Science to Inform Antarctic and Southern Ocean Conservation, but also as a personal perspective and my experience having CAMLR scholarship in the past. Sorry. We have talked about this and the important role that SCAR is playing as giving advice and to the ATCL meetings, and also we are aware, and you are here because of that, of the strong need that researchers have in order to how they feel, how they need to provide, how their science may be useful for these discussions and to provide advice in conservation issues. This is something that Hyoung has introduced earlier, so it's too early for me. I'm not finding the right words, but I will not stop on this on anti-icon research. We have a meeting in the past, and we are going to have another introduction tomorrow of the 4th of August. So I will not stop on this, but just be aware from anti-icon we have 3 research themes related to species and ecosystem, related to impact of human activities, and also integrating or having in the human dimension in social science research. And also we have another research theme, which is the science synthesis for decision making, and we have on this is part of the team now that are working as conveners. But we have this fantastic introduction from Susie. I will not stop there. I just will let you know, you as researcher are in this part of the framework. Now you're researchers and you want to provide science, to provide that, you want that your science helps to improve management decisions. And Susie speak about SCAT and how CEP works and how CAMLR works. So how we as researchers, as every young researchers or not, or from different countries, how we can get involved in these discussions. And for that we have the scholarship schemes. I am comparing now, there are other fellowships, but I am comparing or speaking about the Anticon fellowships that we are preparing together with SCAT, and I will compare this with Cameler Scientific Scholarship, which is where I have some experience on that. So in both cases, the scholarships want to facilitate our capacity building. There are some differences about the amount that we can provide to each of these scholarships, but the important issue here is that we, as Anticon scholarships, we want to provide an opportunity to participate at the CEP meetings and the scientific committee, Cameler Scientific Committee. And this is something similar with the Cameler Scientific Scholarships. And why is this important? It's something that Keith talked about this previously. There is, in these forums, it's not only about science. There are other items, there are other issues that are playing in these decisions, and that is very difficult sometimes from scientists to understand what is going on in this kind of meetings. So we want to provide, to help, to facilitate researchers to participate in these meetings, to understand the discussions and see how they can contribute with their science, and also how they have to explain or share their science. Sometimes we have to be brief. This has been said in advance. We have to be brief. We have to have a clean vision to share in order to be considered by policymakers. Something that is important to be aware is when we are participating at the CP or Cameler, we are not there as individuals, we are part of a delegation. The difference, our voice represents something. So we are, in the case of Cameler Scholarship, we are part of a national delegation, and if we attend as part of the SCAT Anticon Fellowship, we are going to be part of the SCAT delegation. You're representing the scientific community, and that is important. And that is why both scholarships has the idea to have a mentor. In the SCAT Anticon Fellowship will be someone from the SCAT community, a mentor that has experience in these kind of meetings and helps the fellowships to go through these meetings, to go to review what is important for each of these, for CEP and SC Cameler, and to provide a paper that can be useful for improving discussions and some kind of examples Susie has shown recently, some minutes ago, sorry. And at this point, for me, I will give a short idea of, it's not only about how get involved, but why getting involved. And this is for the wide community that are listening now. Your research matters. You don't feel afraid to apply for a scholarship. Your research matters. It doesn't matter, maybe it is not the high quality impact at SCAR, but it's something you might provide a point of view or fill a gap of information that was not considered before. So don't feel afraid of applying, because what you are doing, it matters. Your voice matters. And this is in relation to, we all have different point of view. We have different backgrounds, and this vision, this diversity is important to be listened. So remember that it is actually, you can see now, I am speaking in English, and you can see the difficulties I have at the beginning to start. But your voice, my voice is different because I am a woman, a Latin American, I am where I was raised, where I was born. That is part of diversity that SCARS needs. And the Antarctic community is, you are going to get enriched by the Antarctic community, and the Antarctic community will be enriched by you. This is important. This is important to think about balance, to think about diversity, to think about having of building a common vision around the conservation of Antarctica. And as Keith says, this is these kinds of places are not easy. It takes a long time, long discussion. Sometimes it's frustrating, but don't give up. Keith told me that once, and I followed that. So be strong. This is a very interesting place. You can make a change. You can give your voice. So we hope that many of you want to apply for these scholarships to be part of this interface between science and policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you. I am getting very interesting questions, or rather suggestions or advice from the Q&A folder. But just to be safe, just to make sure we have enough time left for discussion, I think I will go on to the final speaker, Natasha Gardiner. Natasha is one of the 3 co-leads of the synthesis theme of anti-con. Natasha herself is an ECR. So you just heard from a more senior member to encourage how to be involved with some useful tips and information. But Natasha will talk to you about her real life experience as sample cases. Thank you, Natasha. Please.
Thank you, Hyoung. Just share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Can you see that, Hyoung?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well, thank you for that kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I am Natasha, and like Hyoung just said, I'm an early career researcher at Gateway Antarctica at the University of Canterbury here in Christchurch, New Zealand. And my PhD topic is kind of similar to this whole mini symposium's theme, but in particular, I'm interested in the drivers and barriers for successful Antarctic science policy interactions, and also what success actually means to some of the people who operate at the science policy interface. Alongside my PhD, I'm also privileged to work as an environmental advisor at Antarctica New Zealand, and in this work, I contribute to New Zealand's input to the CEP. So I guess I'm at the very beginning of my research career and also my journey into the Antarctic policy space. And so I just want to give a very honest and brief overview of what that experience has been like for me so far, and also possibly provide some food for thought for others who are at a similar stage or are wishing to embark upon a similar journey. So I was lucky enough to go to this year's ATCM and CEP in Berlin on the New Zealand delegation with my ECR hat on. And for me, this was a pretty massive moment in my career, pretty big highlight. And when I started to think about what got me to this point, it's been a combination of opportunities, moments of pure luck, and also some challenges and barriers that I've had to face along the way. And I think the first barrier to overcome as someone who's interested in getting involved in the Antarctic science policy space is where and how to actually begin. In my case, I decided to apply for an Antarctic postgraduate course at the University of Canterbury, which offers a transdisciplinary education across many Antarctic topics, all the way from the biological sciences right through to Antarctic governance. And this course really opened my eyes and gave me a broader understanding of not only the biophysical and environmental elements of the Antarctic, but also how humans engage with the continent and its surrounding ocean. And I think that gaining this really broad view is extremely important for anyone who's interested in engaging in the Antarctic policy space, because the policy world is a totally different one from the world of science, and you really do have to be able to see things from different perspectives. So right after that postgrad course finished, there was a window of opportunity for me with a job opening at Antarctica New Zealand. And I would say that this was a moment of pure luck, because if you are someone who's interested in working in the Antarctic policy or environmental management space, there is not an abundance of jobs. It's a really small community. And so for me, I'd actually applied for a number of jobs at Antarctica New Zealand before I got this one. And so that's why I've put on the right there that I had to learn to persevere in the face of disappointment. But for this reason, I do think it's really important to grasp opportunities as they arise. In saying that, imposter syndrome is a real thing, and it can feel quite crippling, particularly when a lot of the people who are engaged in the science policy space have been doing it for many, many years. And so as an early career researcher, it's really easy to feel like you're out of your depth or you're not knowledgeable enough to be there. And I guess for me, an antidote to this feeling is surrounding myself with incredible mentors. And I will do a shout out here to Daniela Liggett and Neil Gilbert, who are my PhD supervisors, and also Keisha Poirot, who's my boss at Antarctica New Zealand, who all wholeheartedly believe in me in all of those moments when I don't believe in myself. And I think that's really important. And it was also through Daniela and Neil that I got this opportunity to be involved with SCAR through Antarctica. And the last couple of things on my list of challenges includes becoming comfortable with fuzzy. And by this, I'm referring to the fact that the relationship between the Antarctic science and policy worlds, and also the way in which these two communities work together, are not always straightforward or clear. And as we've already discussed in this session, these kind of two-way knowledge exchange processes occur via formal and informal pathways and take place on the front stage at the meetings, but also on the backstage at the domestic level, and also at the person-to-person level. And a lot of that stuff can feel quite invisible when you're new to it, and trying to wrap your head around exactly how it all works can be really challenging. And I do suspect that a lot of the more kind of experienced people on this call would agree that it does take years to build this understanding. And even then, it might still be quite confusing. And lastly, there's always going to be this inevitable trade-off between time spent on becoming a really good researcher versus time spent on learning about policy and how to have an impact. And again, having really supportive mentors who can help you prioritize is really useful in this regard. So here are just, I guess, my takeaways for any other early to mid-career researchers who, like me, are at the start of this journey or are interested in getting involved. So firstly, find ways to open your mind and think about Antarctica beyond your own discipline. This might mean, reading or engaging with material that's outside of your realm, your usual realm or your field. Also have a serious think about what impact you want to have and why your research might be useful. And in turn, that will help you identify who you need to speak with. Just like Keith said, do go out there and email and call and try and meet up with these people. I put lurk there because I have literally read about scientists who work in the same building as the policy people, lurking by the lift, ready for the person to come along and jump into the lift with them and have a conversation. Say yes to opportunities and apply for, the fellowships that Metcha has just spoken to us about. And again, I can't stress enough the importance of mentors. And if you don't know who to approach, you can have a look at the mentor database on the Apex website. Get engaged with SCAR through its various groups. Obviously, as we've discussed already, SCAR is a key mechanism through which science feeds into the treaty system. So getting engaged with SCAR groups is a really great route to policy impact. And building positive relationships with key people is a bit of a no-brainer, but it can be a little more difficult than it sounds, and maybe we can explore that a bit more in the discussion, but it is really important, so I've included it there. And then, of course, come to New Zealand and do the postgraduate course I spoke about. Applications are currently open, but also check out similar multi or transdisciplinary courses at your home universities as well. And yeah, again, that just trying to open your mind. And then I've just got a final slide here with some hopefully, helpful resources for anybody who is interested in engaging in this space. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Natasha. The initial arrangement was for me to leave 45 minutes for discussion. I don't think I was too bad. Okay. Now, one thing I would like to note, there are a number of good and willing people among the panelists and the audience, like chair of CP, head of the delegation of certain national delegation. So let's have a good discussion. Before I turn to Neil Gilbert, I also note that there are very nice questions. Some of them are painfully good. Like we need sort of performance review of SCAR, how good it has been to delivering advice to CEP and other parts of the Antarctic Treaty System. Now, Neil, please take over.
Fantastic, Hyoung Chul, thank you. That was a really excellent suite of talks, and it just struck me how lucky we are to have this wealth of expertise and experience on the panel. And to add further to that, I'm also pleased to introduce Birgit Njåstad from Norway, who's also joining our panel discussions. Birgit leads the Antarctic program at the Norwegian Polar Institute in Tromsø and has had various positions in the institute over the last 2 decades. And throughout that time has worked extensively and broadly within Antarctic management, policy, and research-related issues. But most importantly, Birgit is currently the chair of the Committee for Environmental Protection, which you've heard several of our speakers refer to, and has been in that role for the last few years. So Birgit also brings that particular perspective of being, in some ways, a recipient of the advice that SCAR is providing to the Committee for Environmental Protection. And I think will add tremendous value to our discussions as we get into those now. So welcome, Birgit, to the panel. Now, we've got some questions coming in, which I will turn to, and we've also had a couple of questions submitted to the panel from through the SCAR portal. And I'd just like to start with one of those because it intrigues me in a number of different ways. The question that was submitted is, what are the main challenges that the panelists perceive to be standing in the way of more effective science policy interactions in the Antarctic space? So there's a little bit of an assumption there that we could be more effective in providing scientific advice into the treaty system. But I'd love to hear the views of the panelists. Keith, perhaps I can turn to you to start with, if you want to give that a go.
Thanks very much, Neil, and thank you to whoever posed that question. And at the risk of sounding like a politician, I might actually flip the question round a little bit. And perhaps rather than saying what are the main challenges standing in the way of something, I would say actually, you know, in the Antarctic space, there's been a lot of really effective science policy interactions. And it might even be better to step back and say, what are the key ingredients that have made the successful science policy interactions work? So what can we learn from things where it has worked? You know, I did an example, for example, in Camelot, the creation of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. That was probably something that a lot of people didn't expect would ever happen, but it did. What were the precursors that allowed that science policy process to end up with a successful outcome? So maybe I would switch it round, because like Neil alluded to, I think there's an assumption in this that it kind of doesn't work. But I would actually say, yeah, there are examples where it doesn't work. But I would try to learn from the examples where it does work, and use that to make things more effective in the future. I might have just dodged the question there, but hopefully that's still kind of a useful insight.
Well, that's really interesting. Happy to hear anything else from any of the other panelists if you want to jump in there. Birgit, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, thank you, and hi everybody. Well, it's I have to say as a start that I agree completely with Keith and his starting point on maybe the importance of flipping this question. We of course have a number of places where we can do better, but I think we need to remember that actually the interface and the dialogue is quite amazing, I would say, in the Antarctic. And I think, you know, we're starting out with a starting point that the Antarctic Treaty builds on science as sort of the core element of governance, and that helps us as a starting point. There are a number of things that one could pull up as an issue that is a challenge in the interface and the dialogue between the policy side and the science side. And maybe in one sense, what could pull it down to the sort of the simple word time. And time has a number of aspects to it. I mean, from the research side of things, doing research is a time-consuming thing in itself, but also time-consuming to get the results, and thus getting results that are relevant for management who has asked the question. So that's one time aspect. Time for the researchers not to do real research, but to do work on the interface aspect, on the synthesis work, and the ability to use the time on that in a world full of pressures on publications and so on. That's one issue. Time that the decision-making process take, we already have been there, and I think all the speakers have brought up all the points I would have brought up. They're so important. The time, the decision-making process is a time-consuming process, and I think the picture that Keith showed with sort of the all the elements of the policymakers need to take into consideration when doing management advice is quite important, and that is why things are going to take time. But not the least, I think, to take the time to speak to each other. I think that's what I wanted, the way I wanted to go in this. It takes time to sit down and talk to each other and have the conversation. And I think this is where maybe I see the opportunity to strengthen our dialogue even better, is in the context of being able to have a common understanding of what the issue we're trying to respond to is, so that the research and the synthesis and what comes from the science side is not tailored in its answer, but tailored to answer to the issues that actually are plaguing the policy side, if I can put it that way, and also maybe having a bit of an understanding of those other elements that play into that context. So finding time to have discussions between the science realm and the policy realm on the issue without committing too much, but rather have that good conversation to inspire each other. Maybe a bit of a simple answer, but I think an important one. But I'll come back to the starting point from Keith. I mean, we must not forget in this that we are actually doing quite well, but there are aspects that we could work on. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. You made a point there that I will draw on, but first of all, Natasha.
Yes, no, I just wanted to put another spin on it, I suppose. Perhaps I'm too young and bitter, but I'm going to take a bit more of a pessimistic stance. And I guess this relates to actually the first question that popped up in the question and answers box around kind of the Emperor Penguin issue. And I guess science must be viewed as, you know, many things, and like Tom said, it must be accessible and relevant and interpreted correctly, and importantly it has to be viewed as credible in order to actually have an impact at the science policy interface. And I just think a major challenge recently is that entirely falls down when the credibility of science is challenged, and particularly if it's challenged in the face of misinformation or some form of pseudoscience. And I guess this has been an issue for the climate change debate for many years, if anyone's read Merchants of Doubt, and it just kind of makes me wonder as well around going back to that communicating uncertainty. And, you know, there's a fine balance of how we communicate uncertainty, and there's kind of, we say the science community, but actually the science community isn't always in consensus themselves. And so, you know, the treaty system's built up on that precautionary principle. And so how do we ensure that while we are communicating what we don't know, we are still acting upon what we do know? So, yeah.
Thank you, Natasha. That's really interesting. And I was also struck by the point that Tom made. You mentioned, Tom, about sort of the maturity of science, and in some ways science that has been well developed over a period of time, that has been well published, well tested. It's easier to portray that to the policy community. But often we are trying to raise issues that are emerging, and it might be new science that hasn't had that maturity or sufficient testing through the normal science process. So are we only ever going to be putting forward old science, or mature science, I should say, to the policymakers? And when is enough science enough?
Yeah, I can say a couple of things about that. I would say that, you know, I suppose we'd have to leave it to some extent to the judgment of scientists, you know, as to whether something new and important. I mean, it may not be too much of an issue to bring forward something as a new emerging issue that to keep an eye on, that we're working hard on, but to, you know, for policymakers to be aware of and keep coming back to us for more information on. So that's one way of looking at it. I also, it made me think of the Antarctic Environments Portal approach, where you know, you write and submit a paper, and then every periodically, you know, I submitted a paper a few years ago. Periodically, I'm contacted to check whether what we submitted is still up to date. And I think that's a really great approach as well, because it you know, it helps keep what's published there updated and relevant, but also, yeah, incorporates new robust findings if they have emerged since the original publication.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I mean, there is an important point there, isn't there, about this iteration between the policy and the science community. SCAR's advice isn't necessarily, as Keith said, for multiple reasons, isn't necessarily going to be picked up straight away and acted upon. It may take a period of time in order for something to work its way into and, for want of a better phrase, have impact in the policy world. So I'd be interested in hearing some reflections on that process of iteration. And perhaps at the back of my mind is, how well are the policy requirements understood by the science community? And is the science community delivering everything that the policymakers need? Or does that relationship need a bit of backwards and forwards, perhaps over a number of years, before policymakers feel comfortable enough to change policy and make decisions? At the back of my mind here, I'm thinking marine protected areas as well, which has been going on that conversation's been going on for a long, long time. But is it always clear what the policymakers want? Susie.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but just a few thoughts. I don't think it is always clear what policymakers want, but equally, you know, I think this has to be a two-way discussion. I think there's often an assumption that, you know, by scientists, policymakers just need to tell them what they want, and then that would be clear, they could provide it. And equally, it goes in the other direction. Scientists are thinking, well, you know, we've got all this information, but, you know, we just need them to tell us, you know, what is it that you actually want? And that the assumption that there's some sort of clear black and white answer to any of these questions is perhaps not always that helpful. I think there's been quite an interesting effort to address this within, certainly within the CEP recently. The CEP has a 5-year work plan. I'm sure Birgit can explain more on this, but this is a really helpful tool for planning their work, but also what it then does is it includes science needs. So they set out requirements for information or research and data that will help them to address those priorities in the 5-year work plan. Some of them are quite specific to topics such as climate change. There's a climate change response work program with a whole suite of science needs. We went through a process earlier this year where we tried to get information from across all of the SCAR science groups on how their work might match up to those science needs that the CEP has set out. And in large part, you know, most of those science needs were very were in some way or another being addressed by SCAR groups. But I think there was then the question of, well, are there other science needs, or how could we perhaps elaborate on those needs that the CEP has set out in such a way that scientists feel that they can address them. There is perhaps a missing dialogue somewhere where those information requirements are really looked at in detail with researchers who say, well, okay, we understand that you want information on X or Y, but actually that's not so possible, but we think you might be interested in Z instead. This might be more interesting, and this would actually help you answer your question in a way that perhaps you haven't thought about. So yes, I think there maybe is a bit of a mismatch there, but it all comes back, I think, to a two-way dialogue. You know, it has to be both directions of people understanding what is possible and what they want and what the objectives are, and having an open conversation about that. And it does take time. You know, as Birgit said, these discussions are often, you know, time is a luxury that often we don't have. And sometimes I think it will be over more than one meeting cycle. You know, Neil, you mentioned marine protected areas. I mean, that's taken a very, very long time to make progress on that, and it continues, and it will continue for a long time. And for as much as, you know, we see that things don't move, I think every year they do move just a little bit, and that all takes a lot of time of understanding objectives and understanding what's possible, and having those conversations. So yes, perhaps time is the thing we need a lot more of.
Thank you. Birgit. Yeah.
Yes, if I can just add on a couple of more practical points on what Susie just said, which was a nice summary of where CEP stands, or committee stands, with regard to having a list of science needs associated with its priority work. At the latest CEP in Berlin, the committee agreed with itself that those science needs are probably not framed in a manner that is easily taken up by the science side. And we agreed that we need to initiate a process to frame those questions or needs in a better way, so that there is a better match between the two. Framing those issues will need that dialogue that we are talking about, and something that we hope that we can be in communication on in the year to come when we work on that. So contextualizing, I guess, I don't know if that's a good word, but putting the science needs into a context to understand what they are to respond to, which I think I mentioned earlier as well, will be quite important to get that match between the science that is actually being done on the topics, which Susie says there is something happening on most of these, but are they the right things? They might not match the purpose. So there's a process going on. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
That's really good to hear. And yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to have that dialogue, so that there's clarity of the information that's required. And I think Mecha and Hyoung, Chul and Natasha, you might want to comment from an anti-icon perspective, that in setting out some of the objectives within anti-icon for with a very specific focus on conservation needs, it really is going to be quite important, is it not, to understand where the biggest impact can be had. What are the key issues that anti-icon needs to be working on in order to focus the research effort? Is that something that's being considered within anti-icon?
I was going to give some thoughts in relation to what we were discussing earlier. So if I can do that, and then leave the guys maybe to answer your question. But just to highlight some points, as it was mentioned, it is about science, but not only about science. It is about dialogue, as Birgit mentioned. I think that interactions between, in the end, we are all people talking about something we are worry, concern, or care about. So that is very important to bear in mind. And also an important thing is to and also this is for scientists, we need to think in a flexible way. It is not, as we mentioned, it is not only about science. So when we sit and we dialogue with another stakeholder, we have to be open-minded to understand what are they worried about, and what we say, how we can frame in a way. We are not going to change results, but we can work on how we deliver this message to be understood by the other side or by different sides, and how that could be a concern for other delegation, and how we can work on that. As it was mentioned, it is an iterative process, and we have to be flexible and open to understand other concerns that could be scientific concerns or other kind of other types. But that is that I wanted to mention. Thanks.
Thank you, Mecha. Chul and then Tom.
Yes, okay. For particularly for synthesis, we have been working hard around the interactive mechanisms. For example, identify research needs in a better way and the sort of format of scientific advice that policymakers can easily digest, something like that. But then I will just say what just came to my mind. It'll be still worthwhile to collect successful cases of good science translated into effective policies or measures and follow-ups, and then publicize them. If you cannot write a good textbook or field manual right now, there is no reason we should not try to write a good case study books. It just came to my mind in that way. Also, if you can come up with such success cases and failure stories, it would be good to instill those findings to early career people. Well, it could be anything like I suggested, markup CEP or some sort of tutorial sessions with competitive elements, and make it fun, and providing those cases might lead us to more general or more stand type methods, if you will. Well, that's what just came to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Chul. Tom.
It's just a quick question, but following up for Susie. You mentioned having more conversations, and I wondered whether you could expand on what the platform might be for those conversations, and how to approach facilitating those happening.
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. I mean, I think any sort of conversation and communication is great, whether that's in an informal setting, individual to individual, or organization to organization, or in a more formal workshop setting, for example. It is something I know that Anticon have been thinking about, and we've been discussing a little bit, how would we, for example, set up some sort of perhaps a workshop opportunity where we could bring these two groups together. I think, perhaps part of the issue is that the sort of science and the policy are often seen as very separate sides, teams, and actually there is a fair bit of overlap often. Sometimes it's the sort of same people doing overlapping jobs, or so it isn't completely them and us. But I think any opportunity to perhaps look in some more detail at things like the work plans and the science needs of CAMLR and of the CEP in some more detail. You know, sit down for a couple of days with a really good diversity of people from all sides of that spectrum, and just look in detail about, you know, what's feasible, what's practical, how to translate, as Birgit said, how to, you know, are there things in those in those priorities which could be translated into a specific piece of work, whether that's by Anticon, by some other SCAR group, which would then be fed back. I think any opportunity that we can take to do that would be great. And I think, you know, setting up, perhaps, you know, we have this great facility to work online now, which does make things easier, and I think we should use that more. And I think perhaps we need to focus in on more specific topics as well. I mean, it's very easy to say we should be doing this across the board. We should look at all of the CEP science needs and look at everything, but that is a massive task. So perhaps we need to look, you know, just pick a few priority topics and really focus on what could be built on there, and how could we really tackle a specific area of research or a priority for the CEP's agenda or for CAMLR's agenda in more detail. So I hope that helps a bit, but I think it's a difficult question for sure.
Thanks.
There's some great points there, Susie. Yeah, thanks, Tom, for raising that. And I'd just draw a link with one of the questions that our attendees have asked, which is around understanding and measuring the impact of SCAR's advice. That would be a really neat thing to do, to understand that and unpack that a little bit more, so that we can identify where influence is best placed. Keith, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, this is just a quite brief point, really, but it goes to that point I made in my presentation about finding out who to go and talk to. And actually the reports of things like the CEP and CAMLR and the ATCM, they can be a little bit dry, but they've always got a bit at the back which lists all of the delegates who attended the meeting and usually their email addresses. So just, you know, if you don't read the whole thing, because sometimes that can be a bit hard, but see who was there, see who the players are. And if there's names that keep cropping up again and again and again, then their email addresses are there for a reason. Drop them a line, introduce yourself, and start to have that conversation. They might not come to you. So, you know, maybe you go to them. It's like Natasha's idea of lurking in cyberspace and just keep pestering people till one of them will answer at some point. And you'll learn a bit more. In the classic parlance of these sorts of meetings, while I have the floor, I was just going to say, in that science and policy space, I think I heard it summed up really well in CAMLR when someone said, the role of the scientists is to bring the best available science to the meeting. The role of the policymakers is then to decide if that best available science is sufficient for them to make a decision. And sometimes the terminology gets blurred, but as long as the scientists are delivering the best available science, you can't then determine if it's sufficient to make a decision. That's kind of much more in the policy space. And that's where I think a lot of the differences and a lot of the disappointments arise sometimes. Well, this is the best science we have. And that might be absolutely true, but sometimes you have to recognize that it's not sufficiently compelling yet to make some of the big decisions that you're asking or you're expecting or hoping to be made. Thanks.
Great point, Keith, thank you. And that actually helps and is a really nice link to a question that Alice Oates has asked about communicating urgency. And I think draw a link back to the conversation that we had about working to the needs that have already been articulated. But there is probably an argument to be said that sometimes the policymakers aren't necessarily or always aware of some of the more urgent, pressing, emerging issues that are occurring in Antarctica. So Alice has asked, how do we balance communicating science generally to meeting policymakers' needs with the need to communicate the urgency of issues like climate change? So how does SCAR approach that? If there's something that SCAR thinks the policymakers should be aware of that may not necessarily be currently on their agenda? Susie, would you like to have a go at that?
I can, yes. So Natasha, you've got your hand up as well. Shall I go ahead with this one or? Okay. Yeah, I think communicating urgency is a really difficult one, and it kind of is balanced with communicating uncertainty as well. You know, there will always be some degree of uncertainty, even with the most urgent of issues. You know, there are always, I think, slightly different interpretations, perhaps, amongst the treaty parties about how the precautionary principle should work. You know, should you take action before something becomes a problem, before the effects are seen, or do you need to wait for the evidence of that to really be have taken effect? I take the example of emperor penguins on this. You know, do we want to wait until there is a massive decline in emperor penguins before actually protecting them, or do we take the view that although there is remaining uncertainty in, for example, projections of what might happen to sea ice, you know, a precautionary approach would be to say, well, we should probably do something about it now, and then have the trust in the system to perhaps modify that response if evidence changes later on. But coming back to communicating the urgency, which I think Alice mentioned, of communicating the urgency of issues like climate change. SCAR, as I mentioned, produced this Antarctic Climate Change and the Environment decadal synopsis report for this year's treaty meeting. And I think that probably went much, much further than SCAR contributions to the treaty have done previously, in the way that it set out and communicated urgency and made some quite strong recommendations to the treaty parties on what needed to be done about that issue and why this was important for them, not just to consider the implications in Antarctica, but also to communicate to their governments the importance of reducing emissions globally, and the importance of what will happen to the Antarctic in those considerations. And I think this was a bit of a shift in the way that SCAR has presented its advice in the past. But you know, Stephen Chul, who's led that report, you know, he when SCAR was pressed a little bit on this during the meeting, I mean, he made the point that it would have been irresponsible for SCAR to have set out all of that scientific evidence and information on climate change and not to make a statement on the urgency and the importance of taking these actions. And I would certainly agree with Stephen on that. I think that was important on that issue, particularly to kind of push it a little bit harder than perhaps SCAR would usually do, and to make those points very, very strongly. You know, I think whilst SCAR strives to be as objective as possible, and I think that report was objective in the way that it considered all of the evidence on climate change, you know, I think communicating urgency on issues like that is a responsibility of SCAR. We should, of course, do it very carefully, but I think it's still very important.
Thank you, Susie. Yeah, nicely summarised. Natasha, my apologies for.
No problem. I'm just like accumulating things to add now. Just regarding that last sort of points, I guess as well in response to, was it Alice Oates and the question and answers, that's also where the arts and humanities come in as well to kind of help communicate the urgency. Poetry, any different mediums to help communicate as well. But what I was going to say before was going back to also Keith talking about speaking to policymakers. I've spoken with other early career researchers who say, well, I don't have any findings to actually talk about yet. And I think we shouldn't get trapped in this belief that we need to have findings or even published research in order to speak to policy people. In fact, the earlier you speak to them and the earlier they become interested in what you're doing, probably the greater impact you'll have at the point at which you do have findings, because you've already got some buy-in for your project. And then rewinding back even further to talking again about those, you know, the CEP 5-year work plan and the priorities that are agreed at the international level, a common challenge that's kind of being discussed throughout the literature is that connection then between the priorities set at the international level and the funding agencies at the domestic level, and how we actually get that research funded. And I just wanted to ask the panelists if we do know of any countries or Antarctic Treaty Parties that actually have a really good model in that regard and where it's actually working quite well. Sorry, throwing a question.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Natasha. Good question. Any thoughts on where we think this is being done well? It's a little hard perhaps to sort of single out some countries, but Birgit, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer the question, but again, going back to the discussion we had at the last meeting of the committee regarding the same issue that I brought up in my last intervention on the formulating the science needs. That issue also related to communicating the science needs to the funding agencies. And I think the take-home message from the discussion which we had at that stage, which was quite robust and interesting, was that this is a concern all over the line in most, I would say all, I think, as I heard it, all members systems, and there was no one raising their hand and saying that this is functioning very well at this stage. And my take was that this is a challenge to get the science needs from the management side or policy side matched with and prioritized in the funding system in all countries.
Thank you. Thanks, Birgit. Yeah, an ongoing issue. No other comments at this stage? Oh, yeah, Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in because Daniela Liggett's put a question in the Q&A that is something I sort of noted down before, that she claims she's playing the devil's advocate, but of course she's nothing of the sort because she's lovely. But she does make a good point. I think her question is about, do we need a broader set of perspectives on whether it's just science as the ultimate arbiter, but also I think she mentions us having some very entrenched Western views. I actually think that one of the things that we do miss out on a lot is the sort of cultural awareness of many of those countries that sit around the table in these decision-making bodies. It's typically the same countries that others don't tend to agree with. And I think a lot of that is because we do, or there is sometimes an expectation that they should think the same way that we do because we're all scientists. And I think that an awareness of the different backgrounds and the different cultures that science base is coming from, and the different interactions between science and policy in those different countries, is something that I think is probably the importance of that is probably underplayed sometimes. So when I said before about talking to people, I guess implicitly you can go and talk to people who are in the same country as you, but don't rule out contacting people, particularly if they don't appear to agree or have the same views as you. Trying to find out why and find the background to that difference is pretty much essential to working towards some level of consensus. I realize that's a bit kind of it's like I'm standing on a pulpit, but I am still sitting down. But I'll turn my mute on now as well.
No, that's a very good point. Thank you, Keith. But Susie, you mentioned before in your talk about the extent to which SCAR, certainly SCATS, makes good effort to be as inclusive as possible in the science that's being brought together. So I'm interpreting that as making good effort across the broad suite of the SCAR community to make sure that there's good input into whatever the issue is that's trying to be addressed at the time, in order to have that impact in the policy world, which brought to mind the issue of independence. And a number of you have made this point about the importance of the integrity of the science process and its independence. And yet when I read the science policy literature, there's a lot in there about co-development, about working very closely with the policymakers. So how do we find that balance between maintaining the integrity of the science process within SCAR in all of its diversity and bringing that information together, and yet trying to develop good relationships with the policy community and working in a more cooperative, cohesive way with the science community? Is there a balance there to be found? Have we got it right at the moment, or is there more that we can do in that space? Who would like to have a go at that one? Birgit, have you got a thought? Tom?
Okay, Keith, you can go ahead.
Neil's managed to pose a sort of killer question here. It must be nearly time to finish. I think that it's important to recognize that if you work for, say, a government-funded National Antarctic Program, the science that you do will be directed towards the objectives of that agency that's funding it. You know, it's not a free-for-all. You're going to bid for funds. They're going to fund the things that they want, not because they're not good at the science that you want to do or anything like that, but because they're aligned with the objectives for which that money was made available for that research. So this idea that science has to be sort of completely independent, it's not. I don't think it's black and white. It's a very long spectrum, and I think that the sort of more distinct division is if you use it for advocacy. So if you're using your science directly to argue a point, then that's where you've got to be, I think, more circumspect. But doing science is very unlikely that it's completely, unless you're an eminent maths professor and you just get funded to do what you want in a university, it's very unlikely that it has no direction in terms of who's providing the funding for that work. And they're going to be aligned with national policies. So if you're working a National Antarctic Program, the likelihood is you're contributing towards policy anyway.
Thank you, Keith. Mecha.
Yes, just a very short comment on that, which is a tricky question. But for me, one way to move forward is to recognize where are if we are delivering a paper as a scientific community to policymakers, we should recognize where are some controversial issues where researchers might have a different point of view. I prefer to put that straightforward and understanding that could be differences between scientists too. Not the easy one, but that is mine.
Good point. Thank you, Mecha. Well, I think we are drawing to a conclusion now. So perhaps I can just say if there's anything burning from the panelists that you do want to mention as a last thought, now is your chance to speak, or forever hold your peace.
I just popped in the chat there, sorry Neil, just about
okay.
Heather Douglas has written a really fantastic book that kind of directly answers the question that you just asked about how we can have values and it doesn't actually kind of erode the integrity of the scientific process. So great book if you're interested.
Good point, thank you. All right, well, let me just wrap up then and start by thanking all of our speakers and our panelists. You do an amazing amount of work through SCAR and within the Antarctic Treaty meetings, and you've brought the wealth of that experience and expertise to bear on some really interesting issues. I wish we could talk more on this. Unfortunately, time is against us, but sincere thanks on behalf of everybody for your contribution to the mini symposium. It's very, very much appreciated. I would also just note the SCAR Secretariat have just asked me to mention that the next webinar coming up, starting at 9 AM UTC, which is straight after this, is the SCAR Capacity Building Programme, the SCAR Fellowship Scheme, Visiting Scholars, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Action Group, and it ties in nicely with some of the things that we've just been talking about. So for those of you that are interested in exploring more that you can do within SCAR, that will be a very good event to attend. So let me wrap up now. We are just over time. Again, my sincere thanks to all of our speakers and panelists, and a very good day or evening to everybody that's attended. Thank you.
Thank you.